that can say Mississauga, yes, S-I-S-S-A-U-G-A. Yeah, that's the name.
Hello, and thank you for joining us here for our Saturday matinee on Becoming Mississauga, the Long and Winding Road to 1974. This presentation reflects on the origins of our city during Mississauga's 50th anniversary. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga, and happy 50th anniversary to the city we call home. Hello, and thank you for joining us here with Heritage Mississauga and our Saturday matinee. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, and we're going to explore the long and winding road to how the city of Mississauga came to be. So, becoming Mississauga, the winding road to 1974. The path to becoming a city in 1974 was not necessarily a straightforward one. Mississauga, as many of you know, was not a village that became a town that became a city, but was rather born through a series of amalgamations. And it wasn't a straightforward process for what was formerly Toronto Township to become the town of Mississauga, and then ultimately in 1974, the city of Mississauga. There were many bumps and hurdles along the way, and many times Mississauga, or historic Mississauga, did not get to chart its own course necessarily, but was often dependent upon decisions made at the provincial government. But nonetheless, by 1974, officially January 1st of 1974, our city was indeed born. But looking back, let's set the pace a little, set the stage a little bit, if you will. Following the Second World War, there was a massive population increase throughout large parts of Canada, but particularly in southern Ontario. There were housing booms and new suburbs being built. Some of our biggest suburban developments here in Mississauga, Meadowvale and Erin Mills, and the city center developments under Bruce McLaughlin and others, Applewood, for example, as well, Park Royal. We can go on and on, but really they were born in the years following the Second World War into the late 1960s, at the time when Toronto Township was slowly evolving again through a series of amalgamations to eventually become, in 1968, the town of Mississauga. But early on, it was kind of almost a haphazard development, if you will, without major infrastructure plans for the city. And so and towns were being born and developing new towns, particularly the new town of Erin Mills and Meadowvale by Markborough. They were born amidst this kind of agricultural becoming something else landscape here in Mississauga. But it was determined by the province that ultimately a new level of administration would be needed, that these largely rural and agricultural areas were not quite equipped to deal with the rapidly increasing suburbanization of the areas. And at the same time, developers were purchasing massive swaths of thousands of acres of land for future development. And again, part of this sees the beginnings of highways and of new town developments. The Highway 401 comes through the QW about way back in 1939, but so on. It becomes a rapidly evolving and changing landscape without yet kind of the complete directional plan on how it's going to evolve. Questions always are revolved around, what does the future hold for, not only historic Mississauga, but other places in and around the west side of the Greater Toronto area today. There were conversations around amalgamation, separation, expansion, dissolution. There were many municipalities involved, not just Toronto Township, or what would become the town and eventually the city of Mississauga, but there were as many as 10 or 12 different municipalities are all kind of facing the same or similar questions of kind of where's that future path lead us collectively and individually. There were a number of studies in the early 1960s. It just became apparent that Toronto Township, against eventually the town of Mississauga and the city, could not maintain the status quo, that there was going to be changes made. There areas around transportation studies that were undertaken as well. And again, the changes, how to administer changes to the largely rural landscape in what would be a rapidly evolving suburban and urban landscape. and who would be charting that course and who would ultimately control those processes, very much up in the air. So kind of this idea that's happening of not really sure what the future holds as of yet. But in the 1950s, even there were proposals made for creations of new towns being born. 1956 proposal by R. Reeve, forerunner to mayor, but R. Reeve, Mary Fix to amalgamate Toronto Township, which is now Mississauga, with Malton, Port Credit, and Streetsville into a singular new town. There was 1959 proposals made by Reeve Robert Speck. That's incidentally where Robert Speck Parkway near Square One gets its name, but by Reeve Robert Speck to amalgamate Toronto Township and Port Credit together into a new town under the name of Port Credit. So there was a movement for a period of time for Port Credit to be the name that would be carried forward, but both were refused by the provincial governments of their era because of this ongoing evaluation and discussion around what the future would hold and what that administrative levels would be like for this emerging suburban area as it evolved very rapidly at this time period. Really, the decade between 1961 and 71, arguably right up to 1973, kind of produces the major changes and the decisions that will impact the future growth of these areas, the future developments of these areas. There were a number of regional government models that were introduced to replace the traditional agriculturally based county administrations. Um, as part of this evaluation and evolution, if you will, a swath of townships and unincorporated villages became incorporated towns through amalgamation, and counties were reorganized into the newly developed regions, if you will. So this is where, again, the Peel County becomes the region of Peel during this time period as well. And then the province offloaded or downloaded or created new powers for regions that counties did not have, including authority over land use planning, social services, and major connecting roads. Just again a reorganization of the administration at the time, and really the government under the conservative provincial government under John Robarts was really focused on municipal reform and increasing governmental efficiencies within it. And so this is kind of the era in which historic Mississauga and Peel, the region of Peel, are come to be. And this idea of let's kind of reorganize ourselves so we can better address the rapid changes that are coming with not only development but the subsequent rapid growth of population, the need for transit and improved transportation, roads, and the like, and services, water, electricity, etc., that we all kind of take for granted today. Everything was kind of on the drawing board of what that future would hold, and so the province was trying to set the stage or set the course for what that future might develop under the direction that future might develop. There also at home there were recommendations that were coming. Our a former councillor, member of Parliament, Hilliard Chapel, he proposed creating in 1963 an urban area under the name City of Mississauga or such other name. So it wasn't yet determined that it would be Mississauga that was moving forward, but there was some suggestion in the early 1960s that there would be a need to reorganize and become a city. This is 11 years before it comes to fruition, but these are ideas that are percolating and conversations that are being had both here locally and at the provincial level. Toronto Township was seen as a rural leftover, if you will, or an agricultural leftover that really needed to catch up to the needs of the modern community, modern world, modern cities that are developing and growing around them, and really started the Hill Chapel and other representatives at the time were starting to really advocate for incorporating as a city, and this again early 1960s. There were a number of proposals through 1963 to 65, and a couple of them, again, the new regional models. Again, part of it was at one point the concept was merging Toronto Township, which is Mississauga, and Trafalgar Township, which is largely Oakville today, merging them together under a new name of Sheridan. And Sheridan's a name that kicks around a little bit, has its historic roots in the lost village of Sheridan around Winston Churchill and the QW today. That's where you get Sheridan Homelands and Sheridan Mall and Sheridan Nurseries and Sheridan College from, all referencing this time period of transition and its historic roots. But those plans, they also recommended that Streetsville and Port Credit would simply be amalgamated into this new area or region named Sheridan. Of course, it didn't come to be. It was met with a great deal of opposition, particularly from those areas most affected, like Streetsville and Port Credit. It was abandoned the plan was abandoned in 1964. And at the same time, end of 1964, beginning in 1965, Toronto Township appealed to the OMB to incorporate as a town. Didn't quite come to be at that time, but nonetheless, they were pushing for what that route forward would be like. 1964, a wrinkle in the plans for Toronto Township become the town of Mississauga was Malton's desire to gain its own independence of a sort. The 1964, Malton's third attempt at separation from Toronto Township. We always look today as Malton as a separate place within Mississauga with its own unique identity and unique histories and perspectives on the city growth. And part of that comes back from this idea to once stand on their own 2 feet as an independent municipality. So 1964 was Malton's third attempt at separation from Toronto Township. The Toronto Township politicians strongly opposed, did not want to lose the large tax and industrial base of Malton. But a plan was formulated by Malton and others to merge Malton with Long Branch, Mimico, New Toronto, Weston, and Etobicoke to create a new, larger Etobicoke. That didn't quite come to be otherwise. It was ultimately a rejected plan. They fought it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, but it was ultimately determined that Malton was not an independent municipality and had to kind of refocus itself as part of historic Mississauga or Toronto Township. And therefore, part of the decision for Malton for its future route forward was again this idea of having to kind of play nicely with the others that were in the sandbox, and that being historic Mississauga also had to kind of come to a resolution over the future of what Malton would be within its own confines. 1965, again, after Malton has kind of made that initial spurn of amalgamation into the new town that would be coming. Port Credit also looked to kind of chart its own course at the time. Although there was interest and kind of pressure to merge Toronto Township and Port Credit together, they did approach Port Credit for merger, but ultimately Port Credit undecided on its own path at the time, and it's already an independent town under its own right. Toronto Township decided not to wait any longer and would move forward without Port Credit. This is 1965. 1966 is kind of that first major warning shot over the bow that the province is going to steer the ship here and not necessarily the individual municipalities. And that came with the Plunkett Report, officially known as the report by Thomas J. Plunkett, Special Commissioner on the Peel-Halton Local Government Review. In the 1966 Plunkett Report proposed that Toronto Township, that's Mississauga today, Port Credit, Streetsville, Milton, Oakville, Burlington, and Brampton be amalgamated into a single-tier municipality, which Plunkett called the Urban County of Mississauga. So the name Mississauga was not created at this time. It had been well used for a long period of time, was already in use, but not yet officially adopted by the new town. And so this is something that 2 years before the town is born under that name and the name is officially selected, the name is already in some local use at the time. Of course, Mississauga Road, the Mississauga News, and the Mississauga Golf Country Club already existed under those names by the time these reports are coming out. However, the Plunkett Report, probably much to the chagrin of the provincial government at the time, met with a decidedly negative response. Almost all the towns involved rejected the idea of this blanket amalgamation. Again, we're not dealing with just Mississauga and Streetsville and Port Credit in this case. It's a much broader amalgamation over a much larger geography or involving multiple municipalities. And almost all of them rejected the concept of the Plunkett Report. Um, 1966, Toronto Township offered its own rebuttal. Not that the province was legally obligated to listen to it, but it certainly engaged them in conversation. The municipality tried to do so, and they proposed a two-tier regional government model. So the region of Peel with municipalities underneath, and then four boroughs based on the metropolitan Toronto example. Those boroughs would be within Peel County. So we look at it, we have three cities today, but they're proposing four boroughs. Those boroughs for historic for the area would be Port Credit, which would be composed of historic Mississauga, Port Credit, and Streetsville. Oakville, composed of Oakville and Burlington. Halton, composed of Acton, Georgetown, Eskeezing, and Nassagaweya. And Peel, composed of Brampton, Caledon East, Bolton, Albion, Chinguacousy, and Toronto Gore. So again, quite a drastic departure from what we see today, this idea of these boroughs. But this idea was championed by our local MPPs, or Hill Chapel and MPP Ted Glista. But however, the province refused to consider this new regional model, but they did move ahead with exploring town status for the new for Toronto Township. Although an uncertain overall path forward, the agitation did bring a kind of a flashlight to Toronto Township's individual concerns, which would ultimately lead to the creation of the town of Mississauga. The Beckett Committee was formed in 1966, really seen as a departure from the Plunkett report, from the earlier Plunkett report. And they supported this new Beckett Committee supported a two-tier government system with three types of districts within urban, rural, and development areas. It did not receive the new Beckett Committee did not receive great support, and much like the Plunkett Committee, the Plunkett report, it was also abandoned by the provincial government. But it does show you that these conversations are starting to percolate more and more, and it's becoming apparent that change is going to happen, whether people wanted it or not. It was just what the matter of that change would be. Etobicoke threw a wrench in the works a little bit when they counterclaimed an area of historic Mississauga. The Malton had sought to join with Etobicoke, Weston, and New Toronto, etc. Earlier on, and here we have Etobicoke saying stop, that they're wishing to annex lands to expand Etobicoke, much like that original plan was. They hadn't abandoned it necessarily, even though the province had shut it down. But here was Etobicoke coming back saying, no, we want to annex lands in historic Mississauga for an expansion of Etobicoke. The OMB ultimately rejected Etobicoke's application for expansion as well, but this halted the program here in Mississauga while that was dealt with. So things kind of keep dragging on and on. We hear that a lot in politics, but of course, there's sometimes that it's out of the politicians' hands themselves as these hearings are taking place and decisions are delayed. 1967 and pushing forward, it was really believed that Toronto Township had the right to become a town, that the population base was there, the tax base was there, the political will was there to kind of take this step forward in municipal reorganization. And despite the efforts of Malton and Etobicoke to halt the process, it did nothing more than to delay it. And Toronto Township marched forward with the concept of becoming a town. And the OMB announced its decision to grant town status to Toronto Township on March 29th, 1967, but it couldn't be called the town of Toronto. So Toronto Township could not become the town of Toronto because the city of Toronto already existed. However, if there was an older claim to name, it was ours. Toronto Township took its name in 1806 with the first survey that came through, where the town of York became the city of Toronto in 1834. So the whole idea, there was a newspaper at the time that they stole our name and we want it back. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So historic Mississauga, Toronto Township, on becoming a town officially on January 1st, 1968, a new name had to be chosen. And that, of course, is where Mississauga is chosen through a popular vote held in the Mississauga News newspaper. The two finalists for the names were Sheridan and Mississauga won handily. There's a whole other story on how the names were selected. We can go into that in a future episode, but nonetheless, the selection of the name for Mississauga was held as a public vote. in the local newspaper. So the town of Mississauga came to be officially January 1st, 1968 through an OMB decision. It was a milestone. It was an achievement, but it's again certainly not the end product and did not really stall that process of moving forward and what the future of Mississauga and Peel County would be. 1969, a new plan emerges and for regional government. Darcy McKeough, what was referred to as the Minister of Everything, Minister of the Treasury, Economics, Intergovernmental Affairs, Municipal Affairs, as part of Bill Davis's provincial conservative government, and really focused on governmental reforms and regional governments. This plan proposed joining Halton County and Peel County and creating a new regional urban county, amalgamating the existing 17 lower tier municipalities into seven. This concept was approved by the town of Mississauga, although in a weird sense, with this amalgamation, this creation of these new larger areas, Mississauga as an individual entity would also cease to exist with them. It could have been a very short-lived town if you look at it that way. Remember, they only came to be in 1968, but here is 1969 looking at a different wave of potential amalgamations. Um, later in 1969, our council here in town of Mississauga changed its stance, and they really focused again back on appeal only. So the original plan under McKeough was Halton and Peel counties together, 17 municipalities into two. But however, the town of Mississauga ultimately rejected the idea of two regions merging or two counties merging, and they focused again on they wanted to turn the focus back to appeal only focus. The new Minister of Municipal Affairs for the province, Dalton Bales, pushed forward in 1970 with a appeal-only approach for restructuring, and it was strongly supported by Premier Bill Davis. Streetsville vehemently opposed, as they would cease to be an independent municipality under this new plan by Dalton Bales. And through 1971 and 72, different proposals for restructuring were crafted and focused on the appeal-only approach. And Streetsville throughout this time continued to agitate and seek its own independence. Um, the OMB also questioned Port Credit's future viability to provide services to its residents. Port Credit was very much landlocked into kind of the development of Mississauga around it. Very little opportunity to expand and to increase its tax base or to bring in new industry in Port Credit. And some of the Port Credit councillors themselves were appeased by the proposal to see ward status conveyed upon Port Credit within the new city structure. So there were questions around Port Credit, but it didn't have the vehement opposition to ultimate amalgamation that Streetsville would have. Streetsville had an expansion plan of their own. They led a boundary study in 1968, and by 1973 they were proposing to expand Streetsville to create a greater Streetsville. They were going to claim 10,000 acres of land surrounding Streetsville from Mississauga. Of course, as you might imagine, Mississauga didn't like this plan very much either, and so there was a very much at loggerheads of what the future of these combined municipalities would be. Interestingly enough, led at that time was Streetsville was led at that time by the newly elected mayor of Streetsville, Hazel McCallion, who of course would go on to a dynamic and lengthy career as the mayor of Mississauga beginning in 1978. But here we are in 1970. She's fighting to preserve Streetsville against the growth of Mississauga. Although again, Mississauga didn't necessarily have the designs on Streetsville initially. This was again part of provincial reorganization for the region of Peel and ultimately the town of Mississauga. Streetsville did say eventually no to amalgamation. Not that the province was listening, but they proposed to annex 10,000 acres from Mississauga for Greater Streetsville. But Streetsville was really, it's not apples to apples here. Streetsville had a population in 1973 of just around 7,000 people, while Town of Mississauga had a population just under 200,000 people. So we're dealing with different levels of municipalities. Streetsville residents organized a couple of groups to push back against the government, if you will. And they were the acronyms for them were SCORE and SPUR. These ideas for creating and celebrating a unique Streetsville perspective on future growth, if you will. Streetsville Town Council submitted a brief to provincial government in 1973 with this idea of clear and independent Streetsville standing on its own 2 feet as it has always done. Ultimately, this request was ignored. There was a decision that had to be made, and it was uh, probably summed up the best between a message between Premier Davis and Darcy McKeough, the minister. Seriously, Bill, we have to get on with this one way or another. They're getting tired. This has been kicking around for a decade, this idea of amalgamation and restructuring with no decision being met yet. And by 1971, it was just the provincial government was ready to move on and kind of have a decision be made. Several plans were brought forward in 1971. Again, with no significant consensus achieved to what the path forward would be. Province ultimately presented three options for the new region. And amidst all of this, the town of Mississauga is marching forward. It's growing, population is increasing. And even though they don't know what that final look at as a region will be, they are pushing for city status to evolve from town status into a city. Again, in part to chart their own course forward. The province ultimately submitted three options for people to consider. They were going to make the final decision, but there were three options on the table. Option number one, a Halton and Peel region without Burlington, Caledon, and Albion. So really kind of a southern central focus without Burlington. Option two, a Peel only region with three municipalities. And option three, a Halton Peel region including Burlington, but excluding Caledon and Albion. Ultimately, it was option two, although some presented as option C, but it was option two that the province moved ahead with. Any reference to an independent Streetsville was dropped, and again, option two was favored by the municipal organization committee without much input from municipalities or residents. Not that there wasn't input, but it wasn't considered as part of the province was going to be steering the ship here. There was no doubt about that. December 1972, the plan was brought to the legislature. It ignored any Streetsville concerns and quickly passed. A decision was made. Finally, it came to law in on January 23rd, 1973. MPP Arthur Mean announced the plans for regional restructuring. The 10 municipality, and ended up being a Peel only focus. Halton was set to chart its own course independently of Peel. But the 10 municipalities in Peel County would be restructured into three: Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. Albion and Caledon and part of Toronto Gore would join together under Caledon. Brampton and Chinguacousy and part of Toronto Gore would be formed into Brampton. And then Mississauga and its many villages, the town of Mississauga and its many parts were all to be amalgamated together to create the new city of Mississauga. This would not include an independent Streetsville or an independent Port Credit. It was to be one municipality under Mississauga by the province. And then in 1974, a region and a city are born. The act to establish the regional municipality of Peel gained assent on June 22nd of 1973, officially coming to be on January 1st of 1974, when the regional municipality of Peel was created, as was the corporation of the City of Mississauga. January 1st, 1974, the City of Mississauga is born. What did it look like? Well, in 1974, a great deal of the population was focused in the south central area of what is Mississauga today, a little bit lesser up towards the Malton area, and then of course you have the Streetsville core and the emerging new communities of Meadowville, which were very much in their infancy, but the bulk of the population was located in the south. There were celebrations held at it. The first one, City Celebration Days, informally held at Square One. They were strung out over a week between January 7th and 12th of 1974. It featured in-mall entertainment, exhibitors, historical displays, and the like. Really focused on kind of the bright future for the city, but it was also geared a little bit towards that shopping personality of come to the mall. This is the early Square One shopping center, and having people come out not only to the newly opened shopping center, but also to celebrate the birth of this the city that has come to be. Of course, Square One looked a little differently than it does today, being in the midst of without any of the suburban development around it, a little bit of an island in an agricultural landscape. But then the official city's celebration were held in September 7th of 1974, called Birth of a City Celebration, and they were held down in Port Credit Memorial Park, and it featured music and dancing exhibits, hockey, figure skating, lacrosse, skydiving. Yes, skydiving was part of it as well. Horseshoes, theater, synchronized swimming, a cycling race, harbor fest, and more. A lot of people had a lot of fun at this event to celebrate the birth of the city of Mississauga. We also had an official song that was created in 1974. This is known as the Mississauga Song by Tommy Hunter. Incidentally, that was something that was kind of the idea was brought to the forefront this year for the 50th anniversary of the city and the creation of a new Mississauga anthem by Mikey Bloom, Mississauga artist Mikey Bloom. But our original Mississauga song, and here's the cover of the album itself by Tommy Hunter to celebrate the birth of this new city that has come to be. And with that, we're going to say thank you for joining us here on our Saturday Matinee and for wandering down a little bit of our collective memory lane as we explore the origin stories behind the city of Mississauga and the winding road to 1974. Thank you for spending some time with us here on the program as we explore and celebrate the city of Mississauga's 50th anniversary. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and we will see you on future episodes here with Heritage Mississauga.
Mississauga, from Square One to the waters, Toronto by the border. We keep growing stronger from all our parents working, from all our